Good evening, everybody. I'm glad to see so many people have joined us this evening. And I know there's people, as Julie said, continuing to join, but we might get started because I know your time is precious and trying to take time out of your busy evenings with children and families and everything. We appreciate your time. So we'll try to stick to the just under an hour of a session. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get going. All participants can use the Q&A box. So you'll see at the bottom of your screens, there's a number of options, and it's the Q&A box that you can use to put in any questions you have as we're going through our presentation this evening. So what we will do is I'll do the information piece at the beginning. I'm just going to talk through all about the EPSEN Act, what's it about, going to just give a brief overview of the history of it, etc. And just to kind of go through some of our advocacy work at Inclusion Ireland around inclusive education. Then I'll hand over to Julie, who's going to do a piece of work around the practicalities of the consultation process, looking at it in a little bit more depth at the actual survey and consultation itself, just to highlight some of the issues there, and maybe some helpful hints around filling in the survey, etc. And then we'll have question and answers towards the end of the session. So I hope that works for everybody. I'm just going to share my screen now and get started with the presentation part. So the EPSEN Act, as you're all probably aware, the consultation process around reviewing this act has started. The government have commenced that. And I suppose the EPSEN Act is the education for persons with special education needs, and that's the language that is used within the Act. Just a little bit about Inclusion Ireland and who we are before we get into the meat of the presentation. So we're a national rights-based advocacy organisation. We're also called a civil society organisation, and our sole purpose is to work towards the full inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities by supporting people to have their voices heard and advocating for rights under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that important convention later on throughout this presentation. So just some of the pieces of work that we're involved with. We provide an information service. We're particularly focused on providing information in accessible ways to people with intellectual disabilities and their families. We campaign for policy and legislation changes. We work in solidarity with disabled people and their representative organisations in holding government and state agencies to account for their progress under UNCRPD. We research issues affecting people with intellectual disabilities and their families and publish reports based on people's lived experience. So you're probably, if you know us as an organisation, you'll see, you know, in December, for example, we published a report around alternative and augmentative communication. We published a report last year around progressing disability services for children. They're just a couple of the relevant reports to mention this evening. And they're all based on listening to people with intellectual disabilities and their families and pulling together current thinking and information so that we can lobby and campaign for change. And we work for changes in how services are provided, pushing for a move away from a charity model and towards a rights-based model, which we feel is very important for children today and their families. So just to have a conversation about the EPSEN Act 2004. Basically, it is the piece of legislation that sets out the legal framework for the education of children with special education needs. Again, that's the language that is used within the Act, special education. It states that children with disabilities should be educated wherever possible in an inclusive environment. And it also states that children with special educational needs should have the same right as every other child to an appropriate education. And I suppose when the EPSEN Act was passed in 2004, it was seen as a central pillar of the National Disability Strategy. And it was seen at the time as groundbreaking in putting inclusive education on a legislative statutory footing and providing for children to be assessed and their education needs met. And the law itself provides that people with disabilities shall have the same right to avail of and benefit from appropriate education as do their peers who do not have disabilities. And it states that schools and other education providers must offer reasonable accommodation and individualised support to ensure that children with disabilities get free, and inclusive education in their own communities at all levels, and to give them the maximum social and academic development and skills. And for parents of children with disabilities, the EPSEN Act also provides various means for consultation about their child's education. The EPSEN Act not only promises educational equality, but based on its wording, the state has a legal priority to deliver that education in inclusive mainstream settings where possible. And I suppose finally, the Act highlights the need for children to be assisted to leave school with the skills necessary to participate in an inclusive way in the social and economic activities of society, and to live independent and fulfilled lives. So it was a wide-reaching and at the time seen as groundbreaking, but unfortunately, as we all know, 18, nearly 19 years after the Act has been passed, the main pieces of the Act that would benefit children with intellectual disabilities have yet to be commenced. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that throughout this presentation. Sorry, my share screen just went AWOL on me there. Just give me 2 seconds. Thank you. Okay, so you will have seen throughout all our work over the last year that obviously inclusive education is a huge part of our work at Inclusion Ireland, and we are pushing and lobbying for change for children. But just, I suppose, before we get into the EPSEN Act and what you can do as part of the consultation, I suppose it's important to mention the parts of the Act that have commenced and the parts that have not as of yet commenced. Because that's, as I mentioned in the earlier piece, that's important to note because it was seen as groundbreaking, but unfortunately a lot has not commenced. So what has commenced are the sections of the Act which deal with the right to be educated in an inclusive manner, the duties of schools, and the establishment of the National Council for Special Education. So that was all dealt with in the early years of the Act. The things, however, that have not been commenced as of yet are the parts of the Act providing for an individual right to assessment, individual education plans for children, an appeal process, and cooperation between the education and health services. These have all not been implemented yet, and that is a major issue for children and their families at the minute. And I suppose before we get into any more about the issues with inclusive education at the moment, it is important to say that since the Act was passed in 2004, our thinking and the context in which we're living and learning and our children are going to school has really changed. And Ireland did finally, we were one of the last countries in Europe to do it, but finally in 2018, we ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And that was a really important step for our state to take. And advocacy organisations, advocates, disabled people had pushed for this for many years. And I suppose it is important to mention that because the state has signed up to the UNCRPD, that there are differences between what the UNCRPD says about education and what the EPSEN Act says about education. And that's really important to note, and it might be useful for you as you're taking part in the consultation about the review of the EPSEN Act. So just to kind of highlight what those differences are and those important differences are. So the UNCRPD talks about the right to inclusive education really without exception. And it says under Article 24 of the UNCRPD, persons with disabilities are not excluded from the general education system on the basis of disability, and that children with disabilities are not excluded from free and compulsory primary education or from secondary education on the basis of disability. It also states that persons with disabilities can access an inclusive, quality and free primary education and secondary education on an equal basis with others in the communities in which they live. And we know sadly that that's not the reality for some children with intellectual disabilities. The third point under UNCRPD is that there should be reasonable accommodation of the individual's requirements. And that means that schools and school communities should be looking at what the individual child needs in order to access their right to education, and there should be provision for that. The persons with disabilities receive the support required within the general education system to facilitate their education, And finally, that effective individualized support measures are provided in environments that maximize academic and social development consistent with the goal of full inclusion. So the UNCRPD is really clear on the ask of every state who has signed up to it, what we're aiming for and the goal for a fully inclusive model of education. On the other hand, the EPSEN Act is a little less clear on this, and this is something that we need to take note of. So under the EPSEN Act, what is stated is that a child with special education needs, again, that's the language of the Act, shall be educated in an inclusive environment with children who do not have such needs, unless the nature or degree of those needs of the child is such that to do so would be inconsistent with A, the best interests of the child, or B, the effective provision of education for children with whom the child is to be educated. So as you can appreciate there's a lot of get out clauses in the EPSEN Act in terms of inclusive education, which basically says, if we assess that it's not suitable for you to go to your local school, then that's the case. Or else if we say that by you going to your local school, by your child going to the local school, that's going to have an effect on other children in that class, then that's another get out clause. So I suppose there is an issue there, and that's really important for us to highlight that today, and that might be useful in your consultation process when you're filling in your questionnaires, because it does mention UNCRPD. Okay, just to get into some of what we have found, I suppose, when we're doing our work around inclusive education. You may have been aware that we hosted an inclusive education seminar on November the 15th. And at that seminar, we had people with intellectual disabilities, disabled persons organisations, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, the Ombudsman for Children, family members, advocates, department officials and the Minister for Special and Inclusive Education. And we all came together to look at the vision for an inclusive education model and really trying to paint a pathway of what that would look like and the steps that the state needs to take if we're to ever fully realise this vision. And I suppose the things that we're clear on at Inclusion Ireland and our vision for inclusive education, and we'll talk about the reality next, but our vision for inclusive education and what people are telling us they would like to see is that all children get to go to school together, and that schools are designed to support all children from their community, incorporating principles of universal design for learning. So that means that as many barriers as can be removed as possible are removed so that all children can go to their local school. And that might be things around how the school is reconfigured, the space in the school, so that children can have the space that they need to grow and learn, and special and considerations for children about the accommodations that they may need. So that children have choice within their local school. They can be supported in the way that they need, and they don't have to fit into a particular box. So that what we see in it sometimes is the fact that, you know, if a child doesn't fit neatly into either a special class, special school, mainstream class, that it's really challenging then for that child to access the right to education. But we're calling for a much more flexible model of education that supports every child and meets them exactly where they're at. That schools would have resources, and that involves training and education for teachers and special needs assistants. And in our consultations with teachers and school staff and special needs assistants before Christmas, that was one of the top issues that came through, was around the access to training. The environment is set up to support all children, and that the staffing levels are there, and that there's real leadership around the importance of inclusive education for all children. And if your child needs specialist support, it is available. So that's the vision, and that's what we're aiming towards. And we know we have a long, long way to go before we get there. And many of you who've joined us this evening are fighting the good fight in terms of supporting your child to get that vision and that dream. And I suppose the reality of what we're hearing from people on the ground and from the family members we connect with and the schools we connect with is that some siblings have to go to different schools. Some children with disabilities are travelling up to 1.5 hours to school, and they're travelling past in their taxi or their bus or in their parents' car, past 4 to 5 to 6 local schools, unable to get a place in their local community. That teachers and SNAs do not get the training and the support that they need. And when we talk about training, it's not just training at a primary degree level or at a postgraduate level. It's on the ground training and support and mentorship within school environments and communities as well. There's no guidance in special schools, which often leads to a lack of ambition for children leaving school. So, and which has that impact that we're seeing across the board, that only 17% of adults with intellectual disabilities are in paid employment. And schools must go through long bureaucratic processes to get additional resources. We hear that from teachers all the time. And children are missing out on valuing difference, because we know that inclusive classrooms and inclusive schools are good for all children, and children learning together is, has really positive and powerful outcomes for the whole community, and that families are spending days and months and years fighting to get a place like it's charity and not a right, and that is a huge issue for families. So like, we're clear that there's the vision around inclusive education, there is the reality right now for a lot of children, and how do we push to bridge that gap and to step by step work towards that vision and making a better and more inclusive education system for children. And the barriers, as I've talked to a number of these already, but the barriers as we see them are around leadership. And when we say leadership, that is leadership right from the top down, from ministers, the government, department officials, and right down through to individual schools. And we need to see leadership and a vision and a commitment to inclusive education, and a commitment to supporting all children in their local communities. And part of that vision has to also involve having a lot of data so that there's better planning for children, and we know that that's a major issue at the moment. The second barrier, as we see it, is around resources. There's resource needs in the built environment, making schools better and more accessible for children. The numbers of teachers and SNAs clearly needs to increase across the board if children are to be supported the way they need to be supported. And we have called for a very specific ask, which is that classroom sizes will be reduced to 20. It did come down, it's incrementally coming down in budget year on year, but we need to see a dramatic reduction in class sizes over the next few years. Training and education, again, that feedback from teachers and SNAs about that need for ongoing training and support so that children get the help and support that they need. And attitudes and values is another huge barrier to inclusive education. And that's a whole society issue that, the NDA published a report on attitudes to children going to their local schools. And there was, a significant proportion of people who responded to that survey would have said that they didn't see that people with that children with disabilities should be able to go to mainstream schools. So that's an issue, and that's something that needs to be overcome. And when we're talking about going to mainstream school, we're not talking about a child having to cope with being in the mainstream class as it's configured now. It's about meeting a child exactly where they're at, supporting them the way they need to be supported, and giving them the accommodations that they need. And sometimes that's being in a mainstream class for a period of time, then getting individual support, but kind of recognizing that learning and support can happen anywhere within the school environment. So it's a bit of a reimagining of what inclusive education is, not imagining things as they are right now. So we have called for a fully costed cross-government inclusive education plan. So we want commitment from across government parties, so that no matter who is in government, there's an agreed pathway towards an inclusive model of education. We want to see increased investment in local schools, better training, more resources for schools. And we want to see a joining of the dots between the Children's Disability Network teams and schools. The Disability Act needs to be reviewed. That's another piece of legislation we can talk about another day. And we want to see a right to services and supports within our legislation. Right now, there is only a right to assessment in the Disability Act, and we obviously need to see a right to services and supports as well within our legislation. And finally, on what we're calling for, we definitely need statutory guidelines on seclusion and restraint. Unfortunately, that is still the lived reality for some children across the country who are experiencing restraint in school environments, and there are no guidelines at the moment issued by the Department of Education, something that we are pushing for and something that we're told is imminent. And we need better data gathering for planning. So they are all the asks, and just giving you the broader context that we're all living in around the EPSEN Act, because I think that might help when it comes to completing the survey and being a part of the consultation process. So just to say about the review of the EPSEN Act and the stages of it before I hand over to Julie. So the review will have a number of steps, and a number of groups have been set up to monitor and to shape the review. And Inclusion Ireland sits on the advisory group, which is one of the groups that is monitoring and shaping this whole process. And I suppose step one is around the survey element, and that's what we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about shortly. And step one also involves the fact that organizations or individuals can also make submissions to the department. So I'm just going to try and pull up on my screen. Hopefully this works. One second, sorry. Julie, you might be able to do that as part of yours. Sorry, I'll leave that in your hands.
Yeah.
But on the gov.ie website, you'll be able to see all of the steps of the consultation process. So we're in step one at the moment, which is the survey and gathering feedback from family members, from individuals with disabilities. And there's also, as part of that, room to put in a submission. So Inclusion Ireland will be putting in a submission based on all of our asks, and that will be happening in February. A family support group or an organization, you can also put in submission if you want to add more detail. So you have the opportunity to do the survey as an individual person, but you can also do a submission either individually or as part of an organization. So just to be aware of that as well, because sometimes the submission can help you flesh out in a little bit more detailed way what you want to say and some of the issues as you see them. So that is available to you as well. On the gov.ie website, you will also see that they are trying to be as inclusive as possible with this process. So in these initial stages, they also accept other types of submissions, not just written submissions. So maybe for people who are non-verbal, non-speaking, or might communicate in different ways, might have higher support needs, you can think of creative ways that that person might have their say, maybe through a picture, through audio, etc. So there are other ways of doing that, and they give their contact details on gov.ie about how you can go about making an alternative type of submission as well. So that is a good part of this process. So I suppose just to mention as well, before I go on to Julie, that's the first stage and step one. They are also asking on the gov.ie website if you want to be part of a further consultation process, that you can sign up as well. Again, they give an email address there where you can contact them, and we'll give you all of that information at the end of this presentation. And you can write to the Department of Education and say that you would like to be involved in future consultations, focus groups, etc. And that's likely to run over the next couple of months. People will be invited to further focus groups consultations, because a survey does give valuable information. There's no doubt about that. But there's nothing like being in a room with people and gathering people's feedback. You really get better, more in-depth data. And what we find in terms of accessible consultations, it's really good to have lots of different ways of consulting with people so that people can have their voice heard. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Julie, who is going to look in a little bit more detail at the consultation process itself and the survey. I'm after finding the link now for gov.ie. For some reason, it's not coming up for me, but I'll work on that while Julie is presenting, and we can show it at the end. Thanks, everyone. I'll hand you over to Julie.
Great. Thanks, Derval. Thanks for your presentation and for that useful information that you gave us. I am just going to change my view there slightly. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. I have a presentation also. Of course, it's not going to work for me for a moment. Just bear with me. Apologies. Share screen.
While Julie is doing that, just to kind of draw people's attention to the fact that you can put any questions that you have into the Q&A box. I'll be keeping an eye on it while Julie is presenting there, and then we'll go into a Q&A session at the end. So I can see one or two people have already put in some questions and comments, which is great. So feel free to fire away, ask any question that you need.
Thanks, Derval. You can see my presentation okay? It was flickering there for a little while. Great, thank you. Okay, so I just went through some of the consultation process and had a look at some of the parts that might warrant a little bit more explanation or a bit more support, or just to kind of get my head around it, and I thought it might be helpful. So as Derval said, there are a few different elements to this presentation, to this consultation, apologies. So there is a survey for students and persons who have left the education system already. And I've looked at that, and it's quite a simple version of the survey, capturing people's own personal experience of being in education. So if somebody in your family or someone that you're supporting would like to do that, that is an option. There's also a specific survey for staff in schools, so that's an option as well. And then there's parents and members of the public, so that's the one I looked at a little bit more in detail. But as Derval said earlier as well, there also is the option to submit your own submission without the survey process. And if you have specific things that you want to explain about your family members' educational experience, or something that's, you know, the Act has had a direct impact on, that is an option to do. It is worth remembering, though, that if you send an email, that is identifiable, you know, the email address is identifiable, and you're not as anonymous as if you completed the survey. And it is possible to put quite a bit of comment in during the survey, which I'll show you in a little while. So it is a good option to use the survey, but it's also possible to contribute to the consultation in whatever way suits you best. And the email address there for all of the contact with the consultation process is epsen@education.gov.ie. I can put that in the chat again afterwards anyway. And we have until the 3rd of March to submit any submissions. So you do have a better time. And I put the contact details for Inclusion Ireland into the chat earlier on. So if anybody does want a bit of support in putting something forward, or want to check anything with us, you can always feel free to contact us. And we will be very happy to support. So then I went through some of the questions to see if there were any ones that would need a little bit more explanation. And the first one I came across was around individual education plans, and if you were aware that your child did or didn't have one. And it's just to say that in the last number of years, individual education plans, the thinking is changing around them, but also the language is changing around them. So you may have heard of a student support plan, or, you know, a different type of plan that your school would be making with and on behalf of your child. So I would say any plan that you're aware of for your child here could be inserted. And the next part of the survey is around your involvement in those plans, and so there's quite a bit of detail that can be put in there as well. So the next one then that caught my attention was the interactions that you might have with the contacts in the school, or around the school environment and the inclusive education environment. So that would be a special educational needs organizer, the National Council for Special Education, or the National Educational Psychological Service. So that would be a psychologist that you may have met with. And I just felt it was important to say that you may not have met with any of these individuals and still engaged with your child's inclusive education, but you may have. So just so that it's not a source of worry that, you know, there will be different levels of interaction there depending on the experience that you've had in education. And again, you know, you will have opportunity to comment further on that as well. Interestingly, there's a question around the terminology and language around disability or special educational needs. You know, special educational needs is the term that's in the 2004 Act. But obviously when things are moving on and we're talking more inclusive language as much as we possibly can, things are starting to change. So, you know, you have the opportunity there to highlight how you feel about different terminology. An interesting piece around choosing different options. This question is around UNCRPD, which Derval spoke about earlier, and you can choose the different factors that will have an impact on your child's learning outcomes. However, you can actually only choose 3 options. If there is a question like this where you can choose a number of options, you can usually only choose 3. Actually, I couldn't find any question where you could choose more than 3. So if you had as many as I have here, you would be asked to you know, only choose 3. So when this happened to me, I thought it was worth making sure that you can go back and forth when you are filling out the survey. So you can go back to previous pages and it will keep your previous answers, so that if you want to change anything, you know, you'll have to change it manually. You can also save and exit while you're doing the survey, and you can start a new response in a new tab. So that can be useful if you have experience of more than one child having support at school. You know, you can put a response in for each child if that's something that you would wish to do, and if their experience obviously is quite different. So that is possible to do. And just a trick that I use when I'm doing this is I would you can duplicate a tab. So if you right click on the tab when you have it open, you can duplicate a tab. If you want to make sure you come back to something or something like that, you can always kind of keep where you are at it. Now you will have to progress all the way through to get to the end, but it is worth noting in case there's something you want to double check or something like that. When I was going through this, it'll take about 20 to 30 minutes, I reckon, if you're going to kind of fill everything out. Most of the questions are compulsory, so you will have to tick something, unless it's a comment question. And if there are comment questions, they're not compulsory to do. Late on in the survey, there is a question: are any of the following the reason or reasons for your child's special educational need? And you will see here in this list that there isn't a box for intellectual disability, but you can tick the final box which says other, and a line where you can add in what you want to say there is available. So we would recommend that if you want to highlight intellectual disability, that's the best thing to do. And again, here you will only be given the option to tick 1. So I would say if you need to tick more than 1, to just tick other and then put the 2 options in together. Finally, then, this is the last page of the survey where there's an opportunity to comment, and you can write up to 1,000 characters. So a nifty trick I do for this is I would open a Microsoft Word document and type my answer in there first, and then copy and paste. And you can also ask Word in your word count how many characters you've used. If you have something specific you want to say, you can always prepare that way. But this survey, I kept coming back to it. It doesn't time out, doesn't seem to time out, so you can come back to it. And as I said, you can save and exit and come back to it again if you need to and do another response. You see here down at the bottom, save and exit, so it is possible. And also the back button, it's possible to go back through each page if that's something you want to do to double check. I think that is everything I have to say. And if there's any questions, I'll try and address them later on. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Julie. It's always great to get information for somebody who's gone through it and tried to complete the survey, just to see, as you said, some of the tricks of the trade, or how to manage it and manage your time, and your time is precious as a parent. So great to get that information. Thanks, Julie. Julie, if you wouldn't mind, as I'm just talking through the last bits and pieces of just adding in our contact details to the chat box, the other pieces. So as Julie has said earlier, if people do want any follow-up information, or there's any individual issues that you're having around your child and their educational needs, we do have an information and signposting service at Inclusion Ireland. So feel free to contact us and we'll help you as best we can to navigate that. I can see that there's some Q&As coming in, which is great. So feel free to add any questions in, because we will go into the Q&A session in the next minute or two. The other thing to mention is that today, I'm not sure if people are aware, is the evening before Ireland is appearing before the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child Committee. So there is a delegation of Irish advocates who've gone over to Geneva this evening. The committee will be running the next couple of days. And this is where Ireland is asked to state how well they are performing under the United Nations Convention of the Child. And organisations like ourselves and other advocacy organisations, civil society groups, the Children's Rights Alliance, the Ombudsman for Children, have all sent in submissions to the United Nations Convention Committee. And a lot of those submissions have been highlighted in pre-committee work back in September, and will be highlighted over the next couple of days. So we have obviously mentioned things like the lack of advocacy for children with intellectual disabilities in Ireland. So right now there's no representative advocacy for children. Organisations like ourselves do help and support families in trying to navigate the system with information and signposting, but we don't provide representative advocacy. And that is a huge issue of concern when there's so much to navigate for children and for families, and that the system is quite complex. So we've highlighted that in front of the UN. There's also a lot of our work around inclusive education and the need for that inclusive education map and a cross-government commitment to it. And we've also highlighted the specific issue around seclusion and restraint. And we will be running some follow-up webinars online. We had a conference in October around seclusion and restraint, and we will be doing some follow-up work over the next number of weeks and launching a report on that. And we also have highlighted the many complex issues of children accessing disability services, therapeutic services within schools and within the community. And as we also today, the heartbreaking interim report on the CAM service and access to mental health services. So all of those issues will be before the UN over the next couple of days, and it will be interesting to see the state's response to all of those criticisms, and to see how we respond as a nation and how we take our obligations seriously to children and children with disabilities in particular. So I'll just go through some of the questions that have come in, mainly our comments at this stage. One question here about, does Inclusion Ireland have a specific view on how SNAs are allocated to schools at the moment? As of now, SNAs are assigned to the school, not to the child. And if a child needs one-to-one support, it doesn't seem to be an easy process for the school to apply for and get it granted. And absolutely, and I mentioned that in the presentation, although I didn't specifically mention that process, I did talk about the bureaucratic nature of having to apply for additional supports for a child. So yes, there is a model called, front loading, where a school is allocated a certain number of special needs assistants. And then if there's any issues outside of that allocation, the school has to individually apply for additional supports. And what we're hearing on the ground and from teachers and from special needs assistants is that that is a long and arduous process in many instances. And that is leading to a lot of frustration and concern for family members and for school communities as well. So that is something that we will continue to advocate around. And we'll certainly bring that up at our next education forum meeting. So thanks for bringing that up today. Is this survey a place where we should highlight specific schools, i.e. by name, that are not providing ASD classes? So look, I suppose this is an individual survey for family members. It is up to you what you put into that survey. As Julie said, there is a comment box at the end where you can add additional notes or specific relevant issues that you are facing as a family member. So, you know, I suppose I wouldn't give any direction on that, but I suppose a survey is about you and your family's issues. So there is space to highlight any issues that you're having currently. And again, it is open to you as well as a family member to put in an individual submission outside of the survey process as well. So you could write a letter and you could highlight those specific issues that you're experiencing. Yeah. The survey is anonymous, so I don't think the results will be like, as in nothing will be named publicly. If you were to name a school, I don't think that will go up anywhere publicly. But look, it is up to you how you choose to fill in that survey and what information you choose to put into it. So let's see, is there another one? Would it be possible to do the survey in school with young people, or can it only be done by the families? Yeah, there is a possibility to do that. I mean, the survey is open for young people to fill in. So yeah, I don't think there's any issue with that, to be honest. And as I said, there will be further pieces of this consultation process where there will be focus groups and other elements of the consultation process, so that might capture some young people in school. But yeah, I don't see any issue with that. Julie, I don't know if you can share the screen around gov.ie while I'm talking through those questions, just to see how that's laid out. For some reason I can't share the screen with the internet.
Yeah, I'll try there.
I'll just keep going, and if you can share it, I'll go back to that question again.
Yeah.
So somebody also asked, where do you get information about your child starting preschool? And saying that Myceno is not informative at the minute. So yeah, I mean, again, that might be an individual issue that you might want to call us on, and Julie has put into the chat box our contact details. So our email address is info@inclusionireland.ie, and our phone number is 01855 9891, and that's in the chat box at the moment if you want to take down those details, and feel free to contact us, because we can chat to you about, just give you some information on how to navigate that. There's a specific query around why are secondary schools so far behind primary in being able to offer supports, and what's the best way forward. And I think you've named it yourself there, which is it's planning. You know, I think there just hasn't been the planning for at secondary school level. And that's a major issue. And that's, you know, the lack of data that's there around planning, and the lack of forward planning is a major issue. So that's something that we continue to highlight and to push for. What we need to see, again, why we're calling for a cross-government plan around inclusive education, is we want to see a multi-annual plan, year on year, what's going to happen over the next few years, so that children can have their needs met, and there can be adequate planning for children as they transition from primary school to post-primary, or from preschool into primary school. Somebody has asked us to remind everyone of the direct link for the survey, so we might put that in the chat box as well, and we can send it out again when we send out the presentation and the slides to everybody and the recording. I think I've covered most things. Julie, thanks. You've shared the
is there something
there
specific you want me to, is it the consultation process part you want to look at?
just to look down through the consultation process. Yeah. So, because I just wanted to highlight this earlier. So it just says on it that the online survey is one part. Oh, yeah, just go back up a little bit. Thank you.
Right.
Is one part of the consultation process, and it will be wide ranging, etc. So when you look on the online survey, you've got students and persons who've left the education system, staff, and parents and members of the public. So students and persons who've left the education, that's students who are within the education system at the moment, and also students who've left the education system. So to answer the question that came in the chat box, I'd say it's entirely appropriate to be supporting people within the school environment to complete that survey, if at all possible. So there's 3 separate surveys, one for students, one for staff, and one for parents and members of the public. And you can see there under online survey, there's a link to individuals or organizations that wish to make a submission to the review. So that's where you can email epsen@education.gov.ie and you can make an individual submission. So to that person's query earlier about looking at individual issues that people are experiencing and wanting to give a little bit more detail around that, such as schools not supporting children in their local community, or that more information can be given there in an individual submission as well. So that might answer most of those questions. I'm just going to do a double check now to make sure I've covered everything.
Yeah, and the last one then was around the direct link to the survey, and that's actually here on the very end of this page. So I'll just put that into the chat box now as well.
That's great. So that's the direct link to the survey as well. That's brilliant. Thank you. So yeah, so just to, I suppose, to wrap up for this evening and to thank everybody for coming. I think we've covered most questions, but Julie has, and I've called out our contact details for Inclusion Ireland. If you do need to get in touch with us for any follow-ups, feel free to do that. You can call us on our number or send us an email, and we're happy to support you in any way that we can. We just want people really to engage with this process as much as possible. It is such a huge opportunity to have everybody's voice heard. And this is an image that I saw in a school that I visited recently. We may all be different fish, but at school we all swim together. And I thought it was a lovely example of a fully inclusive school that supports all children in their community. And I suppose that's the vision. And we know that there's a long road to go to get there, but I suppose this is a step that we can take meaningfully together, is to try and influence the legislation as best we can so that it can support children better. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you for your engagement, for your questions, and please feel free to get in touch with us if you need anything else or you want to follow up with us about any element of this. We'll send out the recording and we'll send out further information. Thank you so much.